We left off last video building the UI for our detail screen that you see here in my preview. Well, in this video, we're going to work on connecting everything so that when you tap on a framework, this detail view will slide up and you can dismiss it. So let's talk about how we're going to do that first. If we go back to our grid view, right, that has our grid here, and you can see our for each, right? Remember, this for each is what's building each individual framework title view. Well, in UIKit, in like a collection view, you would have like did select item at index path, right? That may sound familiar to you. We don't really have that in Swift UI, so we actually put a tap gesture on the individual title view, right? So we're going to do that now, and then we're going to explain like how we manage the data and like how we actually do this. So I just want to add this real quick. So on tap gesture, right? And then you see the closure with the code. Again, I just like to have the on tap gesture with just the code. Pretty simple. And here's what we want. Right now, I'm just gonna put print, whatever, just to get Xcode to not yell at me. So I'm gonna kind of relate this to UIKit in order to explain Swift UI. And I want to explain it that way so I can, reiterate the imperative way of thinking versus the declarative way of thinking, right? Part of that mindset shift. Well, in UIKit, you can imagine on this tap gesture, or again, it was did select item at index, whatever, you would say, okay, present the modal screen with that framework. Like you would specifically say that in your did select delegate method, again, in UIKit, right? But that's the imperative way. You're telling the UI exactly when and how to update. Whereas remember, in declarative, we just update the data, right? We update that source of truth, and then our UI reacts to that change and updates accordingly. So again, that's the major shift. So what we want to do on tap gesture here is we want to update our source of truth or our data. And what we need to update is what framework we actually selected. Now here's where we're going to introduce MVVM or model view model. And real quick, this is going to be a dead simple implementation, super basic. As we've been doing throughout the course, we're going to build on that in future apps. But this is kind of like your introduction. Now, before I give the overview of what MVVM is, let me give the typical architecture debate disclaimer, right? No matter what you're doing, what architecture to use is always going to be some sort of debate in the developer community, right? If we're coming from UIKit, there's MVC, MVVM, Viper, MVP. It seemed like there was a hot new architecture like every couple months, right? And that was one of the most common questions I always got asked. Is like, what architecture should I use? So when it comes to Swift UI, it seems like the early consensus is MVVM. But I've seen plenty of dissenting opinions on Twitter saying that MVVM isn't the right architecture. So I guess what I'm trying to say is I don't think that architecture debate's going to go away. You're going to constantly hear other people recommending different architectures. And that's just me giving the disclaimer, like, yes, we're going to learn MVVM, but there are going to be plenty of other architectures. That debate is going to rage on. But again, the early consensus seems to be MVVM. But like I said in the beginning, Swift UI is so early, it's constantly evolving. Like there's a chance we could look back in 3 years and be like, hey, remember when we built Swift UI apps in MVVM? That was funny. Or it could become the standard. The point is, the only thing I can promise you is that things are going to change. So hopefully through this course, I can help you build those fundamental skills so that you can evolve and grow with those changes. Okay, so disclaimer out of the way. What is MVVM model view model? Well, let's start with the endpoints, right? We have our model on one side, which in our case in our app is our framework, right? Our framework object. And then we have our view on the other side, which in this early case is like our grid. So to put it really simply, and again, this is the intro, we're going to build on this more as we practice it and learn it. But to put it really simply, you have your model, which is all the data. You have your view, which just displays everything. And then the view model is a layer in between that kind of handles all the display logic. Again, keeping it big picture. You kind of want your view that displays whatever it displays to be as dumb as possible, right? It shouldn't know about anything other than tell me what to display and I'll display it, right? There should be no logic in your view. That all should go in the view model in this philosophy. Now, do you need a view model for every single view you have? No. The view model should really only come into play when the view is dynamic, like things can change. Like in our example, the selected framework is kind of dynamic, right? You can't like hard code that. However, if all we were doing was displaying this list of frameworks in a grid, like you couldn't tap anything, it was just display. You don't need a view model for that, right? You just read directly from the data or the model. So you only need a view model when there's some logic and changes going on, which to be honest with you is probably going to be most screens. But I want to be sure to say that a view model is not required for every screen. If you're just reading and displaying data, that's it. So that's the high level overview. Again, we're going to get plenty of practice with this in the coming apps. This is your introduction. So let's build our view model. Again, it'll be very simple. So click our Apple Frameworks folder, do Command N for a new file, just a Swift file because it's not a Swift UI view. And we'll call this framework grid view model. I basically use the name of the view and then like add model to the end of it, right? So hit create and import foundation. It's fine. We're actually going to have to import Swift UI. And you'll notice everything in Swift UI has been a struct so far, right? Well, now we actually want to hold state. So this is going to be a class. So you do class, and again, we'll call this framework grid view model. And then the key to make this the view model for your Swift UI is to make this an observable object. So what this allows is for our object to publish information, right? Kind of like broadcast, like, hey, I changed, and we need to make sure we set up the proper views listening to this so they can update their views when their properties change. You're going to see this in action. If that was confusing, apologies, but you're going to see this in action. One quick thing, this should be a final class. That's just a general Swift note. If you're not going to subclass your class, make it final. So what do we need in our framework grid view model? We need a selected framework, right? That's really what we're trying to keep track of here. So we'll do var selected framework, and that is of type framework, and it's going to be an optional because at the start, like, we don't have a selected framework. Maybe if you wanted to give it a default value, sure, we're going to keep it optional. So we've created the beginnings of our view model. Again, it's an observable object. So now we need to tie this to our framework grid view. So let's go back to our framework grid view. Well, first I'm going to drag this up above. I'm going to do project organization at the end, so this will become less cluttered, but framework grid view. So now we need to use our view model here. So I want to do at state object. We're going to explain this, state object. So state object and observed object are similar. I'm going to explain the differences here in a bit. Var view model. So this is us creating our view model, and it equals framework grid view model, right? And we're going to initialize a new one. And we'll come back to this in a second, but that's the difference between state object and observed object. Like when you're initializing a brand new view model like we are here, you want to use state object. If you're injecting it from like a previous view, like when you initialize your framework grid view, you initialize it with a view model, then you're going to use observed object. I don't want to get too in the weeds on that right now because we're just introducing the topic, but we'll dive into that later. So let me stay on state object for a second here. What this allows, let me hit resume because that's bothering me. What this allows is previews, am I right? This is very similar to state. Remember how I said state is kind of like a little piece of data that persists while the view gets destroyed and recreated all the time, right? So you can imagine if this wasn't a state object, right? If our framework grid view gets destroyed, re-rendered, which happens all the time, like anytime you make a change, then this is going to get reinitialized, and every time it gets re-rendered, because we are creating a new view model, it's going to create a new view model, and it's not going to hold state, right? Because it'll initialize with whatever default values we gave it. For example, the default values right now is our selected framework is nil, right? So if we had a selected framework and then it got destroyed and re-rendered, that would revert back to nil. So that's why we want to hold state object, because it's very similar to at state on our other variables, where framework grid view can get destroyed and recreated all the time, but this is going to be held off elsewhere and persist and maintain its data. It's going to stay alive while framework's grid view gets destroyed and recreated all the time. I know I repeated myself a lot there, but state object, observed object, this whole passing data, this is one of the trickier parts of Swift UI and getting things to work correctly. And this is just your first exposure to it. Like I said, we're going to keep building on this and use it a lot. So for now, we're going to use state object with our view model to create that. Now what we can do here is on tap gesture, we can do view model dot selected framework equals framework. And what we did here is this framework, remember that we're passing into each framework title view. When we tap it, we're making our selected framework in our view model equal to that framework, so we know what to pass to the detail view. So okay, we're changing our source of truth, right? That's the whole idea behind declarative. Change the source of truth and the UI updates. Well, now we have to set up our UI so that it updates. So let's go back to our view model here, and we want to create a variable called is showing detail view. And it's going to equal false by default. It's a Boolean. Now this property needs to be published, right? Because we want our grid view to be listening for when is showing detail view changes. because when is showing detail view changes to true, that's when we're going to show our detail view, right? So our grid view back here needs to be like listening for that and waiting. But in order to be able to hear it, it's got to publish itself. So in order to do that, you just add @published in front of the variable. So now our view model, whenever is showing detail view changes, it's going to publish that change, and our grid view, we haven't set it up yet, is going to listen for that and change when it updates. So now while we're in our view model, let's make some space here. How do we get this to trigger? Well, we can put a did set here, did set, and we can do is showing detail view equals true. Let's do a Command B to make sure everything's good. Now what we're doing here is anytime the selected framework changes, we're going to make is showing detail view true, right? So when does selected framework change? When we tap on the grid, this will change. This will flip this is detail to true, and then we'll show our detail view. So back in our grid view, now we need to set up the detail view to show when that changes. And our detail view is called a sheet. So on our scroll view, we can do it below our navigation title. We want to do .sheet. And we're going to do, there's a couple different ways to implement these, but we want to do is presented. So is presented takes in a Boolean, like is it presented true or false? So we want this Boolean to be whatever in our view model is showing detail view is, right? Whatever is showing detail view is, that's what we want, right? Because that's what we're listening to. So back in our grid view, is presented, and we need to make it binding. So $view model dot is showing detail view. And I'm going to get rid of this content parameter label because I don't need it. Put that there. Okay, so what we're saying here is show this sheet whenever is showing detail view changes. Now, what view do we want to show? Well, we want to show our framework detail view. Now, if we initialize our framework detail view, you see it takes a framework. What framework do we want to pass in? We want to pass in view model dot selected framework. There we go. Now we have our detail view. Let's do a Command B. Looks like I'm getting some errors here. Probably forgot something silly. Yeah, it looks like I left this parentheses here from the autocomplete. And I believe I'm going to get yelled at because this is an optional and I'm not unwrapping it. Yes, that's what it is. So what we can do here is a couple things. We can force unwrap. That's the easy route, but that's a little dangerous. What you could do is you could do nil coalescing, and we're going to give it we're going to do mock data dot sample framework just to give it a default value if that is nil. Now that's going to show app clips, right? Because that's our AR kit. That's our sample thing. What you would do in like a real app, a real product is maybe you would have a detail view like this that is meant for like the empty state. And, you know, instead of saying AR kit, you could say, oops, could not find. Instead of the icon, you could have like a sad face, and then your body could say something different. You could pop up an error message. There's so many different ways to handle the errors. For now, we're just going to give it a default sample framework, but that should be set up now to work. If I hit resume on my preview's been acting up. Hopefully it's good. Okay, we'll hit play. Okay, so now we're actually running it. So now when I tap on a framework, we should see the slide up card. Tap, slides up. I thought I was in dark mode. Well, I can't dismiss it. That's by design. I knew that was going to happen. We're going to implement that here in a second. But let me stop this. Weren't we in dark mode? Yeah. Okay, so this could just be a preview thing. I'm confused right now. Sometimes previews act weird. I'm going to run this in the simulator to make sure we didn't mess something up. I think that's just a preview issue. So here we are in the simulator. If you do Command-Shift-A, that'll shift to dark mode real quick. Okay, so we're in dark mode. Let's tap on CloudKit. Okay, so yeah, that was just a preview issue. Again, just showing you previews can be finicky. They can be a little weird. Always test in a simulator or on a device if you see something weird going on in your preview. Don't bang your head thinking you have a bug if your previews are messed up. Double check it on a simulator or a device. So, okay, so this is the expected behavior. I can't dismiss it. I mean, I can swipe down. Remember I said you got that for free. You got the swipe down for free, but we need to be able to dismiss from this button. So we have to use that is showing detail view. We have to pass that down to our detail view in a binding so it has access to it. So when I tap the X button, I can flip is showing detail to false, and then it will dismiss. So let's do that. Okay, we'll stop running this. Back to Xcode, resume the preview. So like I said, we need to pass to our detail view a binding of is showing detail. So in framework detail view, let's go ahead and give it another @binding var is showing detail view, and that is a bool. And what we're going to do here, you notice in our button right here, we're in our H stack with our X button, right? Remember that. We didn't give it an action before, so it does nothing as you saw. Now we want to do is showing detail view equals true. And remember binding, right? I know I'm repeating myself, but I want to drill this passing data home. Binding makes is showing detail view equal to whatever it is in the parent view, which is our grid view. And if you look at our grid view, we're using the view models is showing detail view, right? This is what we need to flip to show and hide the sheet. So you'll notice if I do a command B, what I need to do is update my initializer here for our framework detail view. Because before it was just taking a framework, but now I need to have an is showing detail view binding, right? So let's make our parameters like that. I'm gonna, okay, just for sake of making this readable, I don't know, this annoys the crap out of me when they wrap on 2 lines. I've already explained to you how not to force unwrap it. I'm gonna go back to the force unwrap just so it's easy to read and looks nice for you in the video. Again, don't force unwrap it, but just for ease of understanding and ease of seeing it, I'm gonna force unwrap it. And now in the binding, we need to pass in $ view model. It's gonna happen here too, is showing detail view. Part of it is my font is ridiculously huge. I guess I'll have to live with that. Now you know why my code is nice and clean and readable, because stuff like that drives me nuts. Okay, so what we're doing here is passing the binding, like I said, from the view model into our detail view. So now when we flip that back in our detail view, everything's gonna, trigger and we're going to hide the sheet. So let's run this on the simulator again, just to be safe. Build failed. I forgot something. All right, what's the error here? What did I forget? Missing parameter. Okay, the previews. I remember I told you previews can be a headache. Like we just didn't update our preview here with our new is showing detail on our detail screen, right? So, right, we added our is showing detail view to the initializer. Well, you got to update your previews as well. Now, when you do bindings, right, because you're not really passing anything into the preview, you can do .constant, we'll say false. This is just a way to kind of like hard code bindings for your previews if you want to do that. So now if I run on the simulator, we should be good. I'm going to go back to the grid view here. Okay, back to the simulator. Okay, so now when I tap on health kit, I can swipe down. That was good. Tap on health kit again. Now when I hit the X, all right, what did we mess up? So stop running this and take a look. Okay, I found my issue. Embarrassing, but we leave this in because this type of little stuff happens, right? So I literally spent like 3 minutes debugging, making sure everything I had connected was working. And I was like, the binding's fine. Like this should be working. What's going on? Again, these are these silly mistakes that all programmers make. Well, when I'm tapping my X button, right, is showing detail view, I'm setting it to true. So of course the detail view is going to still show when I'm tapping X. I'm setting it to true. I need to be setting this to false. So again, super silly mistakes can kind of lead to, you debugging for a few minutes the wrong thing. So hey, happens to the best of us, but we switched that to false. Now let's run it on the simulator. And now, let's go to Catalyst. So now when I hit X, again, now we're flipping it to false. So now it goes away. 4 little characters messed me up for a few minutes there. But our data is all being passed around, working correctly. You got the intro to MVVM. Let's go to our view model just to kind of rehash it a little bit. So like I said, it is a class and you want to conform to observable objects. This way it can broadcast its changes. The stuff you want to broadcast, you put a published in front of it. So now anytime is showing detail view changes, it broadcasts, it publishes, and then here in our grid view, here in our sheet, right, our sheet is listening to that view model is showing detail view. So whenever that changes, our sheet shows and dismisses accordingly, as long as you set the right Boolean. But that's kind of the very simple example of how all this works. If you kind of understand it, great. If you're still a little confused, don't worry. Like I said, this was just me showing it to you, just our introduction. We're gonna work with this in future apps and get more in depth, more complex. Like if you look at our view model, pretty simple, right? We just have one variable that changes and then, we broadcast a Boolean when it changes. But you can imagine like a real app, there's gonna be network calls in here. Maybe there's other functions with other logic. So these can and will get more complex in this course. But again, I just wanted to show you what it was all about. Let's move on to the next video.